Now, in the past couple of hours, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, was asked about that figure and Diane Abbott's interview.
She corrected the figure, and that's the figure, and it will be paid for by not going ahead with the cuts in capital gains tax.
And is it a bit embarrassing that your Shadow Home Secretary got the numbers wrong? You're obviously trying to get voters to put their trust in you in this election.
Not at all. We've corrected the figure, and it will be absolutely clear now, today, and in the manifesto. I'm not embarrassed in the slightest.
Well, that was Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, obviously following an earlier interview that Diane Abbott, the Shadow Home Secretary, had done about the figures on policing. And I'm happy to say that Diane Abbott is here with me now. Despite what Jeremy Corbyn has said, it is embarrassing. It's embarrassing that you don't know your figures on a key policy.
I do know my figures, and as you will know, I did 7 interviews that morning, and that was the 7th, and I misspoke. But I do know my figures.
You didn't know them in that interview. Let's have a listen to it. In fact, it was with LBC and Nick Ferrari. Let's just take a listen, and viewers can make up their own minds.
So how much would 10,000 police officers cost?
Well, if we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for
Sorry,
10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost. It will cost about £80 million.
About £80 million?
Yeah.
Diane Abbott, that is hugely embarrassing. It's not just misspeaking, to quote you a bit earlier. You just don't know your figures and you're not on top of your brief.
If I didn't know my figures, why was I able to do 6 other interviews and give the figures correctly? And you need to ask why the Conservative Party is so anxious to move the debate away from the 20,000 police officers.
We'll come on to that because we're going to speak to a Conservative in just a moment. But back to that interview. Never mind that you did 6 or 7 interviews. This is now an election campaign. Front benchers and government ministers are expected to do reams of interviews. This was a major policy announcement for you. By your own words, you want to make this a cornerstone of your manifesto. You didn't know the figures.
I did know my figures, and if you'd listened...
Why didn't you say them then?
Because I misspoke, as you heard. If I didn't know my figures, I wouldn't have been able to repeat them correctly in 6 other interviews.
Which interviews did you correct them? Because I listened to one of those interviews. You didn't mention the figures at all. You said it was all going to be costed and it would be in the manifesto.
I did 6 other interviews. The point
But
is...
you didn't mention the figures in those other interviews. You decided to talk about the figures, and they are basic figures. £300,000, which, as Nick Ferrari said, would have meant £30 per police officer. That's embarrassing. You were then struggling to correct that figure. Did you actually not know them at all and you were guessing when you were asked about it on air? Or what is your explanation?
I knew the figures because I've repeated them many times.
You haven't. I haven't heard you repeat them at all. I've just heard them from that interview.
I can repeat them now. And I'm concerned that you don't want to talk about policing, which is something the public is concerned in, particularly the rise in violent crime. And you do want to go over and over. And Nick Ferrari...
But that's your fault, Diane Abbott. I mean, you want to talk about the issue, and we were all prepared to talk about the issue of policing and the claims that you are making that the police forces have been underfunded and you want to recruit more officers. But by going on air on a major interview where you just completely fluffed the figures, whether you knew them or you just chose not to say them or you couldn't remember them, actually doesn't do your cause any good.
The public will understand that you're not willing to talk about the real issues, and the real issues are that we have lost 20,000 police officers since 2010 and we're seeing a rise in violent crime.
You want to be Home Secretary.
You
want to be Home Secretary. How do you think an interview like that... We couldn't find the figures in a press release, by the way, earlier, so I do dispute you claiming that you did know those figures. And if you didn't know those figures, how can you claim to want to be Home Secretary in charge of the police forces of England and Wales? Do you think you've instilled confidence in either the police forces or the voters?
People that listened to any of the interviews I gave this morning, with the exception of the LBC interview, will know that I do know the figures. And I wish you were prepared to talk about policing.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about policing, which is why we have Dominic Raab, a Conservative, on the programme. I'll talk to him about that. But people will be worried that you are not across what you should be in terms of this brief that you came on the airwaves to announce as a key part of your policy. I mean, do you think it's important to attach the right figures to major spending commitments in this election?
Of course I think that, and that's why I attached the right figures in 6 interviews out of 7. I also think it's important that a major programme like yours is prepared to talk to the Labour spokesperson about policing.
Yes.
Because people deserve to know what the Labour Party is saying.
All right, well, let's talk about how you're going to
issues.
pay for it, which is by reversing the cuts to capital gains tax. So what level of capital gains tax will it be under Labour?
We are going to reverse the cuts in capital gains tax in order to fund a number of
No,
things.
I understand that, but what level will it be?
Including the 10,000 police officers. But just let me say why it's important to have 10,000 more policemen, because we've lost 20,000 under Theresa May and we've seen a rise in violent crime. We currently have some of the lowest rates of capital gains tax in Europe.
Right, but what are they? What will they be under Labour? If you win the election, what will you reverse the cuts to be? What will the 2 levels of capital gains tax be?
We will bring them back to where they were before. That's the point.
And what are those levels?
The point is that it will save us nearly £2.7 billion, and that's what we're going to use, both to pay for the 10,000 policemen and for other areas of our manifesto. And just in case you're saying that none of it's costed, we will produce a manifesto which is costed and is paid for. And we hope, as the campaign goes on, that people like yourself will be more willing to talk about the issues.
And
that
we really
concern the
will.
British
But I think
people.
what voters will want to know is that they can trust you with the figures and with the finances. And just one last time, because I fear you don't know what the levels of capital gains tax are now and what they would be if you did reverse them. Yes, it would raise £2.7 billion. That is the figure you put out. But what will the levels of capital gains tax be?
It's not the figure that we've put out. That's the figure in the government's own Red Book, that if we reverse the cuts that the government has announced, that we will raise at least £2.7 billion. And we believe that we can put that money to better use than on tax cuts for the top 5%.